This episode of the Hyman podcast is dedicated to Mary Louise Layton, a good friend, a steady presence, and a proud member of our little tribe. The group chat where laughter lived, support never ran dry, and love showed up in real time. She believed in hard work, in showing up, and somehow she believed in me too. She'll never know how much that meant to me, so I'm saying it now. Mary Louise was a quiet light, dependable, warm, and always there when you needed her most. Thank you for the example, the encouragement, and the space you held for all of us. We still have no idea what your actual job was, but whatever it was, we know you crushed it. Rest easy, my dear friend. We'll miss you forever, and we'll carry the light from here. Chapter 31. The People versus J.D. Hyman. Having lived through and survived my own toxic hell, it was liberating in one respect to have the freedom to finally speak my mind. It was liberating in the sense that I was no longer breathing those toxic fumes. It was liberating in that I wasn't being harangued by someone who gave Lucifer himself a run for his money. It was liberating in a sense that I was no longer waddling around the pits of hell trying to find a way out. That was until I got a letter. Until I got a letter demanding that I shut up. A letter that was just as crushing as my spirit felt when it was all I knew. That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about that letter. We're going to talk about what that letter means, what stood behind it, and what still stands there. Today, we're going to talk about that letter, and we're going to do it hopefully in a way that sheds light on some of this toxicity, and we're going to do it the way it should be done. The way it should have been done all along, out loud and in public. Because this was an affront to me, my fundamental rights, my reputation, and my good name. And we could litigate and relitigate this all day. So without any further ado, court is now in session. Case number, well, who cares? The case of the people versus J.D. Hyman. From the Hyman blog and the Press Play Podcast Network, I'm J.D. Hyman. As a black man living here in America, I am living proof that while all men were created equal, not all men are equal. We're here to dig into the American political system, explore and unearth experiences from the human condition, and be a catalyst for some hard conversations that need to be had. Conversations that demand to be had. No matter what brought you here, I'm glad you came. Once again, my name is JD, and this is the Hyman Podcast. Part 1. An Ode to the Quiet Ones. At one point, I compared the truth to a lion. I mentioned a quote from Another Life. It says, "The truth is like a lion. It doesn't need to be defended. Let it loose. It will defend itself." What powerful words. A long time ago, I realized that toxic people hold a great deal of power, and they amass that power in a multitude of ways. But one of the primary ways they amass this power is by preventing people from telling their truth, by controlling the narrative. I have seen this firsthand. I have seen powerful people sculpt a narrative as if it were clay on a potter's wheel. Sometimes through embellishment and sometimes through outright lies. I was tired of the lies. I was tired of watching people quit their jobs for completely preventable reasons. I was tired of sitting back and having nothing done about it. I was upset because the people who were supposed to be my corporate partners allowed me to sit in that hell despite the facts of the situation. That told me a lot. It told me I was just a warm body sitting in a chair because somebody needed to be sitting in it. I get it. We're all disposable at the end of the day, but some people are more disposable than others, and some people can truly be horrible people. And because they're less disposable, I suppose, they get away with it. Remember, we all have choices to make, and we have to be comfortable with those choices. We have to be cognizant that our work does not define our lives. It is simply part of it. It is a part of who we are. and it most certainly is a part that we can change whenever we choose. I was done being the person who stood on the sidelines. I was done being the person who stood idly by, because as I have said many times before, those who stand idly by in the presence of wrong are just as guilty as the guilty actors themselves. And I was party to an act, all right. So what did I do? I thought long and hard about how I was going to cope with my experience and express it in a way that was both cathartic and liberating. And so I dedicated a season of my podcast to a topic so rarely touched by the mainstream media. And in the course of exploring and telling other people's stories, I decided the next best thing to do was to tell my own. And so I did, in an aptly named episode called Your Water is Brown. In this episode, I went into graphic detail about my experiences, the things I heard, the things I smelled, the things I witnessed firsthand. And it wasn't just my word, it was words from audit reports, public records, and stories that were reported in national and local publications. And then what happened? After that episode was released, my email box was flooded with people who wanted to share their stories. Some were former employees and some still work there, but they were glad that somebody finally spoke up. They were glad that somebody made some noise. And in addition to that, I got some phone calls and text messages with similar sentiments. But one of the most important emails I got was from a law firm, and the subject was cease and desist. The letter opens with a warm welcome from the attorney of record. It goes on to indicate that they represent my former employer and that as part of my employment contract, I agreed to certain things. I'd go into more details, but it was just a bunch of legal jargon. But the thing that stuck out the most was the next section, which reads, "It has come to your insert former employer's name that you have disseminated incorrect, defamatory, and/or confidential proprietary information concerning former employers, its businesses, and its patients and residents in violation of federal and state law." The defamatory commentary. As such, said former employer demands that you immediately remove the defamatory commentary within 10 days and immediately cease any further dissemination or publishing of the defamatory commentary. If you fail to remove the defamatory commentary or produce any new defamatory commentary, said former employer will be forced to initiate a lawsuit. Because said former employer is represented by counsel, all communications regarding this matter should be directed at this firm, not said former employer directly. The next section reads, "By way of background, said former employer has learned that you have created and published a podcast which purports to provide various commentary related to the human experience. Recently, said former employer learned that as part of your commentary on the human experience, you have included defamatory comments about said former employer, which also violates resident privacy pursuant to federal and state laws. Specifically, one episode from your podcast includes the following defamatory commentary." At this point in the letter, they are just citing the episode's transcript, specifically the part where I described the way the building smelled, and there were constant plumbing issues and how there were times when the water from the faucet was literally brown. It then goes on to cite another large swath of the transcript, this time the part where I talked about how Jean and I had made some startling discoveries about some of the patient's living conditions. After that, they got to the point. The letter goes on to read, "Simply put, this defamatory commentary is false and will cause undue harm to said former employer and its business. Said former employer has invested substantial time and money in promoting and marketing its services to its consumers. Further, said former employer has a duty to its patients and residents to protect their privacy, and your continued posting about sensitive information directly harms them and their dignity. Based on the foregoing, said former employer demands that you immediately cease and desist your publishing of any and all content that is incorrect, defamatory, and/or confidential proprietary information as evident by the above examples, and immediately erase the defamatory commentary. Additionally, said former employer demands you refrain from creating, registering, or otherwise using any further websites, podcasts, blog posts, or any other information that would disparage said former employer. This letter shall serve as the sole demand that you immediately cease your unlawful behavior." Yeah, that was a lot. and they used the word defamatory commentary so much it gave me a headache. At the time of reading the letter, it was a lot to take in. And all the time I've been doing the podcast, I had never received a cease and desist, and now I was being told to stop what I was doing because 1, I was allegedly breaking some unknown policies I'd agreed to, and 2, I was allegedly breaking the law. So I did what any sane human would do. I responded to the letter in kind. But first, a lesson in the law. To address this letter, 2 questions had to be answered. The first, what is defamation, and by extension, what is defamatory commentary? And the second, had I engaged in a massive criminal conspiracy to break the law in order to shed light on what was going on at my previous job? First, defamation is, by definition, false statements that are presented as facts that harm someone's reputation. There are 2 forms of defamation: libel, which is anything written, and slander, which is anything that's spoken. To qualify as defamation, a statement usually has to pass a series of tests. 1. The statement is false. 2. The statement is published and shared with others. 3. The statement is about a specific person or entity. 4. The statement is injurious, meaning it causes reputational harm. And 5. The statement is not protected, as in satire or opinion. With a commentary piece, you have additional tests you need to satisfy. 1. The statements are false and not just opinions. 2. The statements imply that someone did something wrong, unethical, illegal, or shameful. And 3. The statements are shared publicly. So, how did I respond? Well, more on that after the break. Part 2. How to cross-examine a liar. So now that you've had a crash course in defamation in the legal sense, how did I respond? Before I go there, let me tell you how to defend yourself against defamation. The best and primary defense against defamation is the absolute truth. Truth will always win. Remember the thing about lions: set the truth free and watch it defend itself? The thing about defamation is that you're wallowing in the free speech territory, and many forms of speech are protected, even against a defamation claim. Aside from the truth, opinions are protected, as in my opinion, Boston is the worst manager on the face of the planet. That, although my opinion, some might argue is the absolute truth. Privilege is also protected. In the media, it's referred to as qualified privilege, which is a protected form of speech, even if it's damaging. Consent is a protected form, and a lack of malice, meaning your statements aren't said with the express purpose of causing harm, but some statements are a matter of public concern. And one of the most protected forms of free speech are your experiences, your perspectives, and your truth. Assuming, of course, it's verifiable, and I was absolutely in no danger of that. So, the first thing I did was attempt to contact the attorney of record. In fact, I tried to call them numerous times, but to no avail. I left messages, sent emails, and you know what I got? Crickets. So I sent a letter, and it reads in its entirety. Dear Attorney of Record, I acknowledge receipt of your letter dated November 27, 2024. On behalf of your client, I take all legal correspondence seriously and intend to address your client's concerns in a manner that respects the interests of all parties involved. A. Allegations of defamation. The content of my podcast, the Hyman podcast, is intended as a platform for discussing systemic issues from a broad societal perspective and is not directed at defaming or harming any specific entity or individual. The statements made in the referenced podcast episode reflect personal observations, publicly available information, and general commentary on systemic issues, not targeted attacks against your client. The background for this episode was informed by publicly available information, including reports from regulatory agencies and independent media outlets, just to provide a broader context to the discussion. It is also important to note that no specific references were made to, and I list the name of the company and their parent company, by name or other identifying information. Any resemblance is incidental and not intended to implicate your client. Moreover, some of the statements in question constitute opinion-based commentary on systemic issues, which are protected forms of free speech under the First Amendment. If there are specific statements your client believes to be false or defamatory, I am willing to review any substantiating evidence provided and will take appropriate corrective action if warranted. B. Allegations of disclosure of proprietary or confidential information. I dispute the claim that proprietary or confidential information was disclosed. The podcast episode anonymized all examples and adhered strictly to privacy laws, including HIPAA. References were based solely on publicly available information and generalized observations. For clarity, I request your assistance in identifying 1. The specific statements or materials your client considers proprietary or confidential, and 2. The specific policies or agreements your client alleges were breached. C. Good faith measure. To demonstrate my good faith and willingness to resolve this matter amicably, I have voluntarily chosen to temporarily unpublish the episode in question. This measure is not an admission of fault or wrongdoing, but is intended to facilitate constructive dialogue while your claims are reviewed. D. Request for additional information. To further facilitate this review, I respectfully request the following. 1. Copies of any policies or procedures referenced in your letter. 2. Copies of any documents bearing my acknowledgement of such policies. 3. Specific examples of the content your client alleges is defamatory, proprietary, or confidential. And 4. Documentation of any alleged harm caused by the referenced content. I requested this information be provided no later than 5 p.m. on December 13, 2024, or that you submit a reasonable request for an extension if more time is required. E. Closing and next steps. I remain committed to resolving this matter fairly and without the need for litigation. Please direct all further communications to me via email or to my legal counsel should I retain representation. Thank you for your attention to this matter. I look forward to your timely response. So, how did they respond? Crickets. I heard nothing. No emails, no letters, no phone calls, nothing, nada, zilch. Quite frankly, I was offended that they pursued this nuisance action, but if I have to really think about it, that was to be expected. I say all this to say your voice should never be silenced, especially by those who are trying to silence you in an effort to control you, or in an effort to control their version of the narrative. I am not interested in revisionist history, just the facts. I was offended for another reason, because I felt like they were trying to impugn my good name, my reputation. I'm not the person who did all those horrible things, and I'm not one of the people trying to protect them. They told me to be quiet, so I raised my voice. They tried to block the way, so I kept walking. I didn't show up to be agreeable. I showed up to tell the truth, even when it burns. Because silence in the face of injustice isn't neutrality, it's complicity. And as for the truth, truth doesn't seek permission, and I will not ask for it. My name is JD Hyman. This is the Hyman Podcast. I'll see you next time. This episode of the Hyman Podcast was written, directed, and produced by myself, JD Hyman. Additional research and story development by Whitney Hall and Sherith Guest. Kevin Aki developed our branding with additional graphic design by Grant Furness. Jim Yosef produced and mixed the theme song Canary with additional music scoring and licensing provided by Epidemic Sound. The Hyman Podcast is a production of the Hyman brand. I serve as the show's creator, producer, and principal. To learn more about this podcast, our mission and vision, or to explore sponsorships and guest appearances, visit us on the web at www.jdhyman.com.